Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Philip Liu with PNSQC, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar, we have our special guest speaker, Adam Light, and Adam is going to be talking about how to update your retrospectives. But before we dig in and get into the topic here, I just wanted to have a quick note here and let you guys know out there in the audience that our call for papers is still open until May 1st, so it'd be great if we could receive your abstract. We are looking for, especially for abstracts in the areas of artificial intelligence and machine learning, as well as security and performance and DevOps. So if you have some ideas to present in those areas, that would be great. And we look forward to receiving your abstracts. Now let's get on with the program with Adam Light. He's going to be talking about updating your retrospectives. And I think retrospectives is really just kind of a fancy word for looking at what you did and trying to improve and maybe think about your mistakes. And I guess that's probably what Adam's going to be talking about today could apply to life as well. Is that right, Adam?
Sure, I think so. I guess I'll let you be the judge of that as we go through it, and look forward to feedback on that and questions at the end.
Great. I'll let you just take it away and introduce yourself and get going then.
Okay, thank you, Philip. My name is Adam Light, and I have been working with retrospectives for about 10 years. Over that period of time, I have run my own company, helping others adopt and use Agile methods, both to achieve project goals and just to transform their organization. Sometimes people come at it with a specific need in mind. Sometimes people come at it with a desire to improve in mind. But the same sort of activities and practices. So that's what I've been specializing in, and I will confess that I didn't know a huge amount about retrospectives when I started that business 10 years ago, but I've sure learned a lot, and I've helped a lot of Scrum Masters come to retrospectives, and so that's the journey that I'm going to follow along today. Please, keep your questions, and Philip will moderate those at the end. Please connect with me and follow up if you want to talk about anything that we cover today or anything that we don't cover. And please also submit an abstract so that you can attend the PNSQC conference and present. And then you can also join my half-day post-conference workshop, which is going to be called Beyond Retrospectives. So today I'm going to sort of go up to that point. I'm going to give a little preview of what we might cover in that workshop. So, the title is Update Your Retrospectives. And when we think about updating our software, our systems, there's a few reasons we do that. One is just to keep pace with evolving technology, sort of the state of the practice advances, and we need to sort of stay with that to be compatible with the rest of the world. We might want to either also be doing it to add new features or to extend the capability of our system to new situations. For example, maybe we are going to, cross time zones with our meeting, and we need some functionality that will enable us to do that. So we can really update by upgrading the platform or by adding a new application. And so that's sort of metaphor that I'm going to use today, is that retrospectives are arguably the most essential part of Agile, because if you're missing anything else, your retrospectives will help you figure that out. But if you're not doing retrospectives, you won't be able to sort of self-correct. So if you don't update as you go, if you don't update your skills as you go, you will run into trouble down the road when your needs outstrip your ability to address those needs. So that's why it's important to continually update your retrospectives. What I'm going to cover today is, as I said, follow the journey perhaps of a new Scrum Master or somebody that's new to retrospective. So I'm not going to assume any previous, deep previous knowledge. I assume that you understand basically what retrospectives are. So you may, depending on where you are, we have a range of people in the audience, you may find more resonance or utility at one point or another along this journey. But I think, as for my case, helping others is the best way, teaching others is the best way to really learn something. You don't, once you've tried to mentor or teach somebody else, you really know. So even if we're covering something that perhaps is old to you, I would invite you to think about how you might use what we're covering to help somebody else more junior than you in your organization to really update their retrospectives as they go along this journey. So following this journey as a new Scrum Master, one of the first most fundamental questions is, what are the use cases? Where can you use retrospectives? And I usually, if I meet someone on the elevator, if you will say, well, there's really two fundamental things for retrospectives. One is we can use them to help us address issues with team dynamics, and the other one is work processes. On the team dynamics side, some of these use cases include team building. You might need to, or might find benefit from using a retrospective to focus on sort of restoring energy to your team after something has gone tragically or wrong or otherwise. You might end up using a retrospective to help teams and team members process conflict or to address some kind of traumatic event. Maybe somebody has left the team unexpectedly, that they've taken another job or had a family emergency or something like that. And we can use retrospectives for self-empowerment and advocacy. So getting the team organized to say, well, if we share a common problem or a common need, let's go out and try to address that need for the betterment of ourselves and our team and our organization. And then lastly, you can talk about ways in a retrospective to improve communication and just the way that the team functions together. So that's sort of the team side of the coin. On the work process side of the coin, retrospectives are often where important technical and non-technical decisions get made. Many times we're so sort of gripped in the everyday of the work that we don't have time to stop and step back and say, like, there's a decision to be made here, or perhaps we've already made a decision by default without being explicit about that, and we need to recognize that and make sure we've made the right decision before we go too far down the road. The retrospectives are also a place where teams will set standards for themselves or address changes to standards, define protocols and procedures, big or small, and then, again, in a more systemic way, influencing the work system. So talking about how they can affect not just the team, but the things outside the team in the organization or on the side of their customer. And most fundamentally, retrospectives are where teams learn how to learn. If there's sort of a metacognition aspect to retrospectives, that's very important. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. The other question or thing that I like to address with people that are new to retrospectives is, well, suppose that you feel the need to approve, what are the relevant idea sources? How can you hope to help yourself to get better? And I think there's really three. One is facilitation. Facilitation is a very old and valuable skill set that's been around for a long time. So just because you're finding maybe a book in the library or something that was 15 years old, doesn't directly reference retrospectives, that's no reason to discount it. Facilitation, the sort of art of helping people communicate in groups or meeting settings, is very old and very valuable. Likewise, process improvement certainly predates the existence of the word retrospective. There's a lot of idea sources there. Among those are things like lean software development. And and then organization development is also very old, and there's a long tradition of that. So like facilitation and process improvement, there's a lot of prior art here that you can sort of mine to make yourself better at retrospective. So don't think that you have to limit yourself just to books that have retrospective in the title or people that are writing about retrospectives directly. Oftentimes the most insightful sources of knowledge are things that have come before that. So the thing that I really want to focus on as we go through this, these different updates is what I'm going to call them, or how I'm going to refer to them, is that when we find the difference between sort of people who are just amateurs, or who are, you know, doing something but aren't really reaching the highest levels of professional skill, and people who are true experts, is really the way people go about practicing their craft. And so this is a really great book that I encourage you all to check out. It's very readable. It's written by very eminent scientists, but it's also co-written by a journalist who is a great way of reading. And one of the things that really stuck with me from reading this book is that the difference is that between sort of amateurs and professionals, if you will, is that the experts employ mental models to attain mastery. So they don't just kind of get out there and wing it and hope they'll get better. They're really thinking about what they're doing and forming mental models of the right way of doing them and how to practice to improve. So again, I'm going to focus on mental models as we go on today.
Gee, is that what I've been doing?
Now, say again?
Is that what I've been doing wrong? Darn. Okay.
I don't know. I don't know. We'll find out, or maybe you can tell us at the end.
Okay.
So, you know, if we think about, as Philip said in his introduction, you know, retrospective is just another word for looking back and seeing what you've maybe done wrong in order to get better. We can say, well, what did change with retrospective? So I said that when we talked about facilitation and process improvement and organization development, there isn't necessarily anything new under the sun just because people started doing retrospective. So what did change? Well, if we think back to, you know, back in the days when we were using Windows 3.1 or, you know, maybe Windows NT or something, around the time when Agile software development started to become a practice that people were taking a lot of notice of and starting to adopt and embrace. One of the main changes that happened at that time, or the most significant change if you kind of look back on it overall, is the shift from focusing on what people might call individual contributors to the team as the unit of the most relevant unit of production and management. And there had been teams, of course, software development teams before that, but really kind of the art of forming and maintaining teams is one of the hallmarks of Agile software development. And so before we were calling them retrospectives, most often we were calling them something like postmortem. And you know, sometimes that has unfortunate connotations because it has this connotation that maybe somebody has died or something has died or gone terribly wrong. But aside from that, you know, the differences between a postmortem and an Agile retrospective are that the postmortem, for one, is usually done relatively infrequently, because in those days, software projects and software releases tended to be much longer, and the looking back and trying to harvest lessons learned was usually done at the end or after the end. Secondly, it was done where, you know, you had these individual contributors operating in an organization, and there was this idea, well, we're going to improve, we're going to have sort of these organization-wide policies and procedures for engineering, and if we can just get our policies and procedures refined well enough, then we can expect every single project to go really well. And that's our goal. And that was sort of the operating mindset. But there wasn't really a strong, cohesive team idea where we're consciously delegating or enabling the team to make a lot of those policy and procedure decisions for itself in order to make itself productive. So what changes with Agile retrospectives, or what changed with Agile retrospectives, is one, this idea of a cadence. So we were doing, if we introduce sprints, and at the time, sometimes the sprints were 3 or 4 weeks long, sometimes they're 2 weeks long, but however often that is, it's a lot more often than the postmortems are happening. So we've got this cadence, and we're looking back regularly rather than only at the end. And we're doing that in the context of this team level container. And at the team level, the team has a shared sort of ideology in the form of this kind of agile set of principles or practices that they've been educated about and they're sort of bought into. So that's really what changed with Agile retrospectives, was not the existence or the type of facilitation or process improvement or organization development. Those didn't all of a sudden advance. It was this shift from the individual in the organization to the team operating in an iterative fashion that really sort of catalyzed Agile retrospectives and really made them so much more potent than they might have been prior to that time. So if we think about moving forward as a new Scrum Master and a new Agile team, well, what does that look like? So, of course, there's a lot of differences, but the ideal sort of generic view of that is that, new Agile team will hopefully have some kind of shared training experience to inculcate or help them align on those sort of shared practices and principles that comprise whatever type of Agile they're deciding to embrace or to follow. They're going to then learn to consciously work in a new way. So there's going to be sort of a conscious beginning to when they're going to work in that new way. And then there's this idea of inspecting and adapting, and that's the retrospective. So, these, we could expand this list and make it more detailed, but those are the basic elements of starting out with a new Agile team. Well, what does that look like from the standpoint of the retrospective facilitator? Well, most Scrum Master type training is about 2 days long. And that isn't necessarily because that's the optimal time to learn everything that you need to learn in order to, effectively operate as a Scrum Master or somebody in a similar role. That is also driven by economic factors and, sort of how much money people are willing to spend or able to spend, and how profitable it is to run an introductory course versus advanced course. So things are that way because they got that way, not necessarily because that's the best way to become a Scrum Master. So you get whatever amount of knowledge you can get in a 2-day class, and if that 2-day class is done well, then you're going to be getting as much the best and the right knowledge that you can. But necessarily, if it has many parts, any one of the amount of time spent on any one of those parts is going to be pretty limited. And so that is the case usually with retrospectives. And I think when you have like a Scrum Master class, maybe in a 2-day course, people will spend, at most perhaps 60 to 90 minutes on learning objectives related to retrospectives. And retrospectives are, given their importance, that can be a potential limiter once you get out of the gate. So what people usually learn in that 2-day course is something like this. We schedule a meeting. In that meeting, we're going to review the sprint outcome and discuss impediments and issues that have arisen during since we last had a retrospective. And then we're going to do something, some kind of exercise to figure out what to do about that. And the most sort of stereotypically common exercise is something like start, stop, and continue. So we're going to we look back, we're going to say, what went well, what didn't go so well, what should we continue doing, and then you're going to try to choose an action or a step or a change or an intervention to focus on in the upcoming sprint. So this is kind of the what you get out of the box, the sort of, I'll call the free trial version of Agile Retrospectives. And that usually will get you, get you started. And because there's a lot of tuning and adapting that needs to take place, and it's usually pretty, if the team has a shared understanding of what they're supposed to be doing, it's usually pretty obvious what's not working, or with a little coaching, it's not too difficult to identify what's not working and what the countermeasure to address that might be. So this will get you started. But as you advance as a facilitator, what I usually tell people is, as soon as you're able to kind of get your feet under you and get the basic Scrum activities or Agile activities for your team scheduled and people participating in them, you should start working on your craft, your retrospectives craft, and not neglect that. And there's really kind of two clusters. I think the most important thing for retrospective facilitators to learn as sort of a through line of all of this is the ability to ask questions. So when we're doing a retrospective, our goal isn't to get people to an answer we already know, or to get everyone to buy in or align in a direction that we think we know. The idea is to help people have, help everybody ask and answer better questions, and the right questions for in a structured way, so that they can come up with better questions for themselves and then answer those questions. So, going in assuming that you know the answer, or assuming that you know the outcome, is not the most effective way. No matter how smart you are, the idea of the team is that the team is more than the sum of its parts, the individuals. So questioning, ways to question a technique, and having a basic debriefing process is often a very good start to that. And then starting to get established with a physical toolkit, so that you have kind of the different ways that you can work with your participants to make progress with your team members as problems become progressively more advanced or challenging, as you start to sort of exhaust those early gains and move into more advanced territory. So with regard to the questioning techniques and sort of getting started down that road, the update that I like to focus on with Scrum Masters at this stage, and I think most of us can remember, again, going back to the idea of mental models. A mental model is very helpful if you can recall it to mind, and then kind of unpack it. So we sort of store these mental models, then we can bring them up. And so having some kind of short, not too many parts that maybe have an acronym or something, helps you kind of get that mental model in mind so that you can deploy it. The one I'd like to talk about with respect to the questioning techniques and debriefing is called ORID. And ORID is a acronym. It stands for objective, reflective, objective, reflective, interpretive, and decisional is what that is. So with the objective part, this is where we're focusing people on facts and data and sort of things that they can sense, not what they think about them, but what their sort of raw perceptions are. And this is a theme that we'll come back to when we talk about more advanced topics as well, is the importance of focusing your attention on the data, if you will. And the data doesn't need to be sort of quantitative data. It can also be emotional or relational, intuitive, from intuitive sources. But what are those facts? And getting those out that everybody in the group can have kind of a shared mind about those facts. So these are some of the questions that we might ask in the first step of the ORID: is what images or scenes do you recall which comments or words struck you. And as we get to more advanced techniques, we'll talk a little bit about some of the things you need to do when you're looking back over a longer period or at a more complex thing in order to just get the basic data out so that everybody can process it in a shared way. So the O is for O of ORID is for objective. The R stands for reflective, and here's where we're talking about the emotional part of things, our reaction to what we saw. So how did these events that you've just described affect you? What were your surprises? What were your concerns? What were the highs and lows? And which emotions describe how you felt? Often it can be really helpful in this part to have kind of a list of emotion words. We tend to get a little bit stuck in our emotions, and we'll just say, well, I felt mad, or I felt, frustrated. But there's a lot of other breadth to the emotions that we might be feeling, and if we can sort of unpack those as the next step, then that's very helpful. The third stage in the ORID is interpretive, and this is the one that most of us, especially perhaps in tech, are wanting to go to right away. This is kind of where, if you just leave the group to its own devices, inevitably, in about 5 minutes, they'll be well mired in the interpretive side of things, having completely avoided those other topics. So in interpretive, we're going to be asking basically, what are the key insights? What are the most...
Adam, we have a question that came in. So in terms of emotions, in your experience, what kinds of emotions usually come to the surface that need to get handled, or kind of, I can only imagine people will get angry or defensive or possibly feel insulted in some way. And how can you identify that and deal with it?
Sure. Well, an example of how you might handle emotions that happen, say, in a sprint, suppose you had a sprint where the events were that you were trying to do a release and things didn't go well, and you had to, stay late, and you had to roll your system back and deploy something to recover from that, and your teammates were there, or they weren't there for you. Your manager maybe was supportive or less supportive. So you have reactions to that situation. So it's important to separate, okay, what was the situation? Well, we had the release, it was supposed to be done at 3:00, but then we weren't quite done until 3:30. And by the time we were done, then immediately problems started coming in, and we spent 2 hours diagnosing that, and, before we could figure out what we were going to do about it. So you're sort of breaking down what happened. But then in terms of emotions, to say, well, how were you feeling when you first noticed this? How were you feeling when, somebody sort of inserted themselves into the process and started giving orders, or when you couldn't reach somebody who was critical to solving the problem, and that sort of thing. So those are the examples of where we would want to talk about those emotions that were going on before we get into kind of the analytical mode of things.
What would you consider to be emotional data?
Well, emotional data is the way people felt, and so just stating how you felt in a way that is separating it from accusation or expectations of others. Just say, like, I felt abandoned because when my team member wasn't there at 5:30 and I needed to do something really, really important under pressure, I felt abandoned, right? So that's an example of emotional data, and it's something that you can't take away, right? If I'm the team member that wasn't there, or if I'm some other team member, I can't come back and say, well, you didn't feel abandoned, because that's your feeling. Like it's an actual piece of what happened. It's not, I felt abandoned because you didn't do this or that. That's where we start to to get into trouble. So the data is really just that raw feeling of what was going on for you at that specific point in time,
Sure.
in the context of what was happening.
Yeah, it sounds like a Scrum Master almost has to be 20% psychologist.
Some people will say that, certainly from the standpoint of coaching. And I think what we're trying to do here is kind of break that down and make, again, if we're taking the progression of the Scrum Master,
Right.
you don't have to go all the way to being a psychologist to
Right.
separate how people were feeling from the reactions of other people to how those people said they were feeling. So that's just sort of the breaking down the skills, basically.
I think it's great to bring this up as a key part of the role, though. So thanks very much.
Yep. Thanks for the question. So we talked about reflective. So interpretive, we get into the analytical and critical. This is where, people don't usually need a lot of help or prompting to get into this mode. It's more, how can we make it productive and make sure that the other steps are getting their adequate attention and being done well in the right order. So once you've done those first two steps, then it's a good time to get into analytical and critical. And the key, usually in this stage, is getting people out of it once they've gotten into it. So then the question then becomes, well, what questions, once we've done an adequate job of interpreting the sort of facts and then the sort of objective part of things, or the relational part of things, then this interpretive part is, we've done with that, then how do we get out of that? And the next part is the decision. So what should we do now? And so this is, again, following the same basic pattern of what a very new Scrum Master might do in the first retrospective. But what we're learning is these questioning techniques, and we're learning this set of steps. And so if you think about those set of steps, they're applicable. Philip asked at the beginning, is this something that we can do anywhere in our life? And I don't know if this will work anywhere in your life, but I think my experience is that if I remember what the ORID steps are, if somebody comes, if my boss comes in and says, look, I need you to go, this thing happened, I need you to talk to the team in the other office on the phone and find out what went wrong. You don't have a lot of time to prepare. You don't really know what's gone on, what to expect. If you remember the ORID steps, you sort of have a few minutes to make yourself an outline based on those steps and think about, in each category or in each segment, what questions am I going to answer to get at the results, the understanding that I need to gain, or that I need to help the team gain. Then I think you'll find that the ORID is applicable in a very wide range of circumstances. The next thing that I want to talk about in the sort of beginning Scrum Master, kind of going beyond the 2-day Scrum Master training, is the physical toolkit. So this can hold you back or sort of get in your way. It's obviously not, it seems kind of trivial, but it's how am I going to learn to interact with people in a group setting effectively? And just talking is usually not the most productive way to do things, particularly if we can manage to get everybody in a room sitting face to face. That's a very low bandwidth way for a group of 6 or 10 people to have a productive conversation. So then this is where we want to rely on the kind of the stock and trade of the facilitation part of retrospectives. And so these are the kind of 4 fundamental tools. I think it's very possible to have too many things going on. And so just kind of going clockwise, I think having the 3x3 Post-it notes in the very sticky or super sticky variety is the best way to go. Post-its that are bigger than that, in rectangular, bigger squares, they just invite people to write too much. And generally, like, you want to keep things focused. The small sticky Post-it notes, and then the super sticky, because otherwise they fall off basically, and then you end up with a mess. So I think that's a case where, like, going with the name brand is definitely worth the extra cost, even though they're pretty expensive. Having a good set of chisel tip markers rather than sort of pointed markers. That's a key thing. A lot of facilitators like these Mr. Sketch brand because they don't smell like chemicals. They smell like fruits, and they're pretty friendly in that regard. But when you get that set, the first thing you want to do is take the pink ones and the yellow and orange ones and the light green ones and throw them in the trash. So those are going to be illegible to people as you're using them. So you really want to just get rid of those from the get-go. And if you are then left with those other colors, you'll be fine. So learning to use easel pads or flip charts can be very helpful. Most of those come in self-sticking Post-it varieties. And here I don't think you need the Post-it brand by any means. If you have difficulty writing, or if you're just learning to write on a flip chart in front of a group, it can be very helpful to have these grid lines on your flip chart. And there's different versions of that. And then the Pentel sign pens are a great alternative to Sharpies. Again, they don't have the odor. They don't make permanent marks on the table or the wall or the people in their fingers. So that's a great way to kind of build out your facilitation toolkit and just make sure you're ready for learning new things, learning new ways to facilitate, basically. And then if you want to go to some sort of slightly more advanced things, there is whiteout tape for flip charts, which is a godsend, because if you spent 5 minutes writing a chart and then you make a mistake, it's a real drag to have to start all over again. The dots for things like dot voting and affinity clustering are really, you can of course write them with markers, but it's a lot easier to do them with these sticky dots. And I recommend getting those in a roll rather than in sheets, because in a sheet, you have to then use scissors to cut them apart, whereas a dot, you can just peel them off and give people 3 or 5 or 7 or however many you want to hand out. It's much more efficient, and it again avoids the need to have the scissors. And then having a timer as you become more advanced facilitator, you're going to start thinking about time and structure. And it's very important to be able to communicate that in a visible way so people understand what the section is meant to, how long the section is meant to take, and where they are in the process. One of the main reasons that people go on and on in groups, which a lot of newer facilitators don't realize, is just because they don't know what the expectation is. So setting an expectation, using a visible reminder to help people stick to it is really helpful. And this will also help you, because as a facilitator, what you need to learn is to get a sense of how long things are taking. And if you always think something's going to take 20 minutes, but it really takes 30 minutes, you're going to keep not scheduling enough time. And so you may not be successful simply because you didn't have a properly tuned sense of time. When you're scribing using these tools, these are some kind of key things, again, that new facilitators often get stuck with. So of course, you want to be able to communicate clearly in your talking to people, but being able to write down what you're saying or what they're saying, it really helps to listen and capture words or phrases in their own words rather than writing what you thought. So, just turn off your brain and just write what you've heard. And if people are saying a long sentence, rather than trying to abbreviate it for them, ask them to summarize it. Doing this, alternating colors, all caps or small caps, is really helpful. And it's really helpful to save that red pen to underline or highlight. So you've got your, you end up with a palette of about, if you get a dozen markers, you end up with a palette of about 6 colors you can use for different kinds of writing, and then 1 that you can use for highlighting. So again, these are not, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. This is great, Adam. I attended a talk about 5 years ago by Moss Drake, and the title of the talk was Low-Tech Project Management Techniques. And sometimes, pencil, paper, and different colors make a huge difference. But, some of these physical techniques don't necessarily work for team members that are in different locations. And So one of the questions that came in from Charlene was, do you have different types of toolkits or tools that you'd recommend for Agile teams that are not in the same location? Because, even though Agile says be co-located, the reality of it is that a lot of times it doesn't work out that way.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a sort of whole, probably separate webinar in its own right. One thing that I will say is that, just to begin with, to answer that question, is that when you're doing retrospectives and you have you want to sort of if you've invited people that are the right people to be in that retrospective, let's just assume that it's your Agile team, you want everybody to have the equal ability to participate. And so if you, the trickiest situation is when you have, say, most of your peers, say you have 6 or 7 people in the room and 1 or 2 people not in the room. That is the most tricky situation, because you basically end up marginalizing those people that aren't in the room. So I think the first way to address that is to look at, from the standpoint of not what tools or techniques, but how can we make sure that everybody participates equally? Even if that means we are somewhat limited in our tools or techniques, it's better for us to all be on a level playing field. So some organizations where they're successfully able to deal with a lot of remote workers, you'll find this sort of counterintuitive thing where, okay, we're going to have a meeting, but we're not, 5 people in the office and 3 people are not, and everybody goes to their desk and kind of interacts through the computer. And it's like, well, why don't these 5 people all get together, and then at least they'd be together? But for certain types of activity, especially with retrospectives being one of them, if you get yourself in that situation, you're basically putting those other 3 people at such a disadvantage that it's going to be really hard to get a full, robust participation in the retrospective. So the first step, if I was working with a new facilitator, I would say, well, get really good at that ORID sort of questioning aspect of things. Like, really focus on the questions that you're answering and making sure that everybody is able to participate at each step in each question in answering them. And then you'll start to learn. You can also get a really long way as a new facilitator with something like Google Docs. If you want to do like a group brainstorm, and instead of writing Post-it notes and posting them on the wall, you say, okay, everybody, write this in your notepad or whatever, and then paste it in. When I say go, paste it into the Google Doc, and we'll sort of affinity cluster it in there. So my recommendation is to start like that. If you go to a really if you try to go to really sophisticated, tool base, sometimes you just get caught up in the tools when you're, as you're starting out. And it's really, the real important part about the retrospective is the questions. As we move past the basics, there's a tendency, we get to this case where the low-hanging fruit has been exhausted. And this chart is called a Pareto chart. Is basically the idea is that, you look at the frequency or the occurrence of your problems, there's kind of the ones that the majority of them are going to be in a couple of categories. And so with new Agile teams, they'll start to address all those things that are within their easy control. They get better at not overcommitting to the sprint. They get better at communicating so that they're all, sharing work on tasks rather than working in individual silos. And pretty soon the systemic issues that maybe all or partly outside of their control or that are harder to address start to come about. And so improvement may reach a plateau. And this is where we really want to look at, using more structure and kind of creating more powerful ways of addressing retrospective. Sometimes we need to look back over more than one sprint to really see the patterns, or sometimes we need to involve more than one team. So we get to the need for going beyond the basics. And if we haven't done some of those early things where we've developed our questioning techniques and kind of developed our technical ability to just communicate with as a facilitator, then it becomes harder to go on when the going gets a little harder. I think a really great sort of update in this regard is around the area of design and structure. And so the sort of classic resource for Agile Retrospectives is this book by Esther Derby and Diana Larson. And they introduce this kind of generic agenda, and they have some examples of how much time you should spend in each of those areas. So again, a lot of teams that are just starting out don't, they might only allocate 30 or 45 minutes for a retrospective, and then they might say like, well, what could go better? Oh, that retrospective was too long, we'll make it shorter. So they might even, start at an hour and then they might shorten it down. The problem is when the going gets tougher and you need to spend more energy to really find the root cause of the problem, you've kind of created a situation where a lot of the things you need to be doing in that you have sort of either never learned how to do, or you've kind of pushed out of your ability to do because you're not giving yourself enough time. So understanding structure and how to design things as a facilitator is kind of the next stage beyond those basics. In terms of framing this as an update, and we talk about mental models, so this is how Diana and Esther have depicted in the book. The mental model version of that that's easy to remember is what we call the ladder of inference. And so the idea is what, so what, now what. And again, this corresponds pretty well to the ORID. The what is the objective, what are the facts. The so what is the interpretive, and the now what is the decisional. So when you think about designing a retrospective, and perhaps you go to, here's some like new technique that somebody told you, or this fancy way to build a sailboat and use Post-it notes or whatever, it's important to have this mental model to map it back to and say, are we really going to get the data out so that we can do the interpretive part so that we can make a good decision? Because, it's easy to get to a decision, but if you don't get to the right decision that's moving you forward, of course you'll make mistakes sometimes, but if you're not able to reliably get to a good decision that's going to move you forward, then you end up in this place where you're not able to advance and your retrospective is unable to carry you forward. So the next mental model is the ladder of inference. And again, it's easy to remember because it has 3 parts. It's easy to remember which part is on the bottom because you think about it as a ladder. And if you go back to Diana and Esther's book, they give you some ideas about how just sort of rules of thumb or ranges about how much relative time you might want to be spending on these different sections, depending on the complexity or the complicatedness of your retrospective. Related to this is the idea of having a life cycle. So a lot of people who become facilitators and start doing retrospectives, they sort of put that retrospective into a box and they say, well, that's that meeting. The retrospective is the meeting, but actually the retrospective meeting is really just a part of the cycle. And you may spend the rest of the sprint in some way or another doing follow-up or design or pre-work in order to sort of keep things advancing forward. So it's important to think of the retrospective not as a discrete event where you do it and then you don't think about it before outside of that meeting, but as an ongoing process. And again, the Diana and Esther's book is an excellent source for thinking about that. Now, when you are then going forward and you're ready to start using, or you need to use some different techniques to kind of get to the bottom of some of these root cause issues, then the question is, well, where will you get those? And there's a lot of good sources, but I always recommend that you have a good sort of mental model structure before you go out to these sources, because it's difficult if you don't have those mental models and that practice to begin with, then you end up just kind of doing these things by rote, but they're difficult and you aren't able to sort of adapt them and put them together in a way that's actually helpful for your team. Some of the best examples or things that I think are most helpful to advancing facilitators and the teams that they're trying to help are some of these, and I've included these. I'm just going to talk about one of them, but I've included them in the references at the end of this talk. The one that I want to talk about is from this website called Liberating Structures. And one reason I want to talk about that is because the website is sort of freely available, so you don't have to buy a book or anything. And the other reason is because this is something that's sort of easy to explain, and I think it gets at something that kind of gnaws at or sort of holds back many beginning Scrum Masters and beginning facilitators, and they think, well, if I let the group just converse, if I lose control of the meeting, I'll never get it back, basically. And this is a way where you can, it's a pattern, it's a mental model. The pattern is called 1, 2, 4, all, and it sort of depends on the size of the group. This is often a good way to introduce or to practice or get a start at facilitating larger groups, maybe if you need to do a retrospective with several teams all at once. The pattern is that you do individual reflection. So each person will have a few minutes to brainstorm on Post-it notes individually. Then they get together and they discuss their individual work with a partner. And then, you sort of proceed up like as a pyramid. And then so the pairs talk to another pair. And then eventually you get to a point where if there's more than a group of 4, then you're doing report outs from the groups of 4. So it helps the group kind of converge on a unique set of relevant ideas without letting one individual dominate, or without all the problems you have with facilitating a group discussion. So it's a really powerful technique that you can start to use when your basic techniques are kind of losing their usefulness, or that the situation is beyond this more basic technique. Another update that I think is really important, kind of takes this full circle back to the beginning of our talk. And so we talked about the kind of big change between, before retrospectives and we start calling it retrospectives, was cohesiveness and the focus on the team as the unit of management, the unit of work. And so the thing that you can do at this stage, if your retrospectives aren't working, is to look and say, well, how cohesive, how focused is my team? And sometimes, often, in fact, you find that the reason the team isn't able to progress is that they're not really enough of a team. And so this is where we do something called team chartering. Again, there's another book also authored by Diana Larson, and in this case, all with Ainsley Neese. And there's a sort of whole set of protocols, just like we have retrospective protocols, a set of protocols for sort of forming that team level container that will then enable you and give you kind of the foundation to do continuous improvement at the team level. So if you find that your retrospectives are, not going well, and you don't think it's down to your skills or as a facilitator, but it's something more fundamental, this is a good place to look. It starts to lead us to that space that's beyond retrospectives, or outside of the core of retrospectives. But it's important to remember that the goal is to continuously improve and get better, and you may need to look elsewhere than just the retrospectives. The retrospectives is just one aspect or one method for addressing continuous improvement. So then, where do you go when the retrospectives sort of start to run out of juice, start to lose their fizz? And these are the things that sort of feedback that I often get when people have reached this point. They say, well, we need to be able to not just work on symptoms, we need to be able to work on the true cause. We want to be able to work on making meaningful change over time. Maybe the thing we need to change is smaller than what we would, is bigger than what we can do in just one sprint. We need to break big improvements into small ones. We need to be able to measure whether we're making progress. And this is what I'm going to talk about in my half-day workshop on the last day of the PNSQC conference. It's the idea of going beyond retrospectives. And to do that, we're going to introduce and really work with something is a pattern that we call the improvement kata, and I've given a reference to it in the slide here at the end. But the big idea with this is that we aren't just looking backwards, but we're looking forward. So we're saying, well, where, not just what's gone wrong or what has happened in the past 2 weeks that we want to improve on, but what's our goal? What's our direction? And then we're acknowledging or finding a way to acknowledge that we don't know how to get there. There's kind of this gray zone that we need to move through. So basically with this workshop, we're going to be looking, because I'm going to wind this up, Philip. So the thing to look at here is, with retrospective, you're fine if you retrospective are looking in the rear view mirror, and that can be the road behind you can be a really good guide to where you want to get to. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes the future, you're trying to go in a different direction, or you need to go in a different direction. And so the past looking only at the past may not be the best guide to where you need to get to. So when that happens, what we are trying to do in going beyond retrospectives is, rather than sort of just picking improvement opportunities that that somebody thinks will make something better, that we agree will make things better, we're sort of trying to pick those improvement opportunities that will lead us from where we are to where we're going, and then enabling us to iterate on that in the process. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I'm going to turn it back over to Philip.
Wow.
I have provided a set of resources here that you can refer to, and I'm sure that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back and take a look at these at your leisure.
Wow, Adam, this has been quite amazing. I was just thinking about your when you talked about emotional data and people actually sharing their emotions and having the Scrum Master kind of facilitate that. That requires a lot of trust in the team environment there, and I guess that's probably a whole nother webinar in itself in terms of trying to establish that environment. But I was just thinking, I'm a Scrum Master myself and certified and done the training and so on. And I was wondering, when you show up and work with a client, or you're a Scrum Master, beyond the certification, what other kinds of trainings are there?
Yeah.
Besides hands-on, right? I mean, besides actually doing it, it'd be helpful if there's some other stuff besides just showing up, just doing it,
Sure. Well, you can certainly take retrospectives training, but the thing about something like retrospectives and being hands-on is what you really need is the opportunity to practice. So the best training to look for, if you want to practice in a safe environment and kind of advance your skills, are workshop type training where you're focusing on the ability to learn something new and then experiment with it, with other facilitators, and that's the best way to get practice, kind of in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, great. We certainly look forward to your workshop on Beyond Retrospectives on, I guess that's October 16th, right? The last day of the conference. Really look forward to that.
Whatever the last day is.
Just to close up today, our abstracts we're still open, and we're open until May 1st. Just to let you guys know the process, we take in abstracts, and we've got over 100 so far. And then what we do is we evaluate all the abstracts. We have a committee that evaluates the abstracts, and we narrow it down to the top ones, and we ask those top abstracts to proceed and write a paper, which will be included in our proceedings. And we do have a top 3 best presentation award. So if you have your abstract accepted and write a paper and come present your paper, and you're one of the top 3, then you actually get invited back as an invited speaker. And we have our 3 winners from last year that are going to be at this year's conference. It's a fantastic conference with over 37 years of history, and it's very, very unique in that it's a small conference, probably about 350 to 400 people, so it's not huge. So you'll be running into people multiple times and really be able to get to know folks. So I look forward to seeing you at the conference, as well as Adam and his workshop. Today's webinar has been recorded, so we will be sending out notification to the attendees on the webinar link as well as the slides, and you can find us on YouTube, so please follow us. So thanks very much, and everyone have a good lunch or a good afternoon. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks.